Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're here to talk about social procurement, moving from concept to implementation. We're excited to be joined by a wonderful panel of experts from around the country who've been actively working towards social procurement and how that can benefit this social impact and social enterprise sector in their communities. We're joined by our moderator as well, David LePage, who's got a wealth of experience in this area, and we're looking forward to learning from them how we can move social procurement from a concept to implementation here in Newfoundland and Labrador specifically. Before we get started, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, and we respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been lost forever and can never be recovered. We also acknowledge the island of Huktumduk as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. And we acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatuktavut. We recognize all First Peoples who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As First Peoples have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. So today's event is brought to the network here through the Social Innovation NL. It's a coalition of a number of partners made up of a number of organizations, spearheaded out of the Center for Social Enterprise at Memorial University, but includes members from a range of community organizations, some of whom are running very successful social enterprises, and some of whom have been at this work for a number of years and have taken leadership roles on that. So we're joined by a number of groups, including Choices for Youth, the Federation of Cooperatives here in Newfoundland Labrador, First Light, the St. John's Friendship Center, Smart Ice, Stella Circle, Food First, and Homelessness St. John's. So why are we having this conversation today? Why is this important for us? Really, we're here to talk about how we build prosperity by enabling thriving social purpose organizations here in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. This is a lot of work that's going on in communities across the province, and we think that this work can be further amplified by developing enabling policies and procedures that allow for social procurement to happen. So how are we going about doing this? Well, we're looking at building community prosperity by enabling thriving social purpose organizations here in Newfoundland and Labrador. We want to become the meeting point where diverse stakeholders can join forces to collaborate and transform the communities that they work with to enhance all residents' well-being. So what are we doing? The coalition itself at Social Innovation NL, comprised of all the partners, we're looking at how we can increase access to diverse capitals by advancing social purpose organizations through the investment readiness continuum. That's really how the coalition got started, was when the federal government announced all the funding through the investment readiness program and the social finance fund. We wanted to ensure that Newfoundland Labrador and the organizations doing great work here had access to those opportunities. So we wanted to get together and find ways to strengthen that social finance ecosystem in the province, and then to advocate to ensure the recognition of social purpose organizations, the impact that they have, and ensure that fair distribution of resources for the province, for the regions itself, and that it wasn't only concentrated in areas with well-established networks in place. So that was sort of what brought all of the partners together, and why it was important to sort of have it nested within the Center for Social Enterprise at MUN. So the investment readiness program is launching a second stream, and this again is to help social purpose organizations, which can be registered charities, nonprofits, for-profits, as long as there is a social purpose that is clearly articulated, to help build their capacity to participate in Canada's growing social finance market. The ability to plan for that kind of work, growth, scale is really the intended nature of the program. And so for folks who are in the province here in Newfoundland and Labrador, there is a call, and you can connect with the Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador with Nicole And this is being supported through the Government of Canada, as well as the Community Foundations of Canada, this particular stream. So there is a call. The due date will be November 22nd. So when we're talking about social procurement, what are we really talking about here? It's kind of a tangly concept. So just to give some context before we are introduced to our panelists, social procurement, the way that the group here has talked about it and formulated thoughts around it, it's really how do we leverage existing purchasing power and bargaining power to amplify the impact of the businesses that are creating this work. To recognize and acknowledge the importance of social value as an economic driver in our communities, to promote inclusion of best practices, to generate community capital. When communities, big or small, have access to greater assets and ownership of those assets, we can create community capital in a meaningful way. Look at how we can drive further impact through the social purpose organizations that are delivering this work already. Looking at new ways, new pathways for social value creation through procurement, through targeted supports in that context. And then looking at how social purpose organizations can diversify their revenue strategy by being included into different contracts and tenders that they might not have otherwise had access to before. So when we're talking about social procurement, these are some of the things that our group has talked about, and are certainly our panel today and our moderator will have a lot of information to provide the folks here with. So with that said, I want to introduce our panelists. So we'll be moderated by David LePage, who's the managing partner with Biosocial Canada. And we have a panel of experts, including Heather Tizard, who's with the Chief Procurement Officer with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, Jennifer McCabe, who's the Procurement Advisor with the City of Ottawa, and Rachel Orser, who's with the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo and is the Director of Supply Chain. So I am going to stop sharing, and I will turn it over to you, David.
Great. Thanks, Doug. I think it's a great kind of format that Doug laid out for us for the discussion today, in the fact that the network is looking at an ecosystem for supporting, how do we build community capital? How do we make healthy capitals? And from the discussion of social procurement is really one of what we look at is three components of that ecosystem that really drive it. As Doug pointed out, there's the supply side, which is the social purpose organizations, the social enterprises, the co-ops, diverse owned businesses. So the suppliers who are trying to sell their products and services into the market, because as they increase their sales, they can increase their community impact. And then the finance piece, the social finance piece, is sort of fuel in that ecosystem. But then what we realized, and why Social Canada started, and where my journey into social procurement started, was the realization that the real power in this social value marketplace comes from the decision of the purchasers to look at the value they want to create. So when Doug mentioned as one of the pillars, one of the foundations of social procurement is leveraging existing purchasing to create value. That's really kind of driven by the demand side, by the purchasers, because if they're the ones who say we want to buy things, we need to buy things, but we want to buy things that are actually going to help contribute to community. So this is a great panel today because we have a whole spectrum of government-driven social procurement engagement. We've got Heather, who's they're on there more at the beginning of their journey, and then Jennifer, who's been practicing for a while, and Rachel, who's been implementing for a while. So it's a great thing. So I'm going to ask each of you to take 30 seconds and just introduce yourselves and sort of like, where are you on the journey? So do you want to start, Heather? You're located out there on the East Coast.
Sure. Thanks, David. So my name is Heather Tizard. I'm the Chief Procurement Officer with the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we are just starting this journey towards developing a social procurement policy. So we were given a mandate to do that, and we've been for the last year or so just doing jurisdictional scans, looking at everybody else's policies, seeing what other countries, other provinces, municipalities are doing. I mean, it's obviously much stronger in the municipal sector than the provincial sector that we've seen so far, and just seeing how people are implementing those policies. So we've completed some online consultations and are working through some other internal consultations now before going externally again to finish those consultations and then pull together that policy. That's where we are in the whole system.
Great. And Jen, where the city of Ottawa, where are you guys at?
Sometimes I don't know, but I think for today, last year, our council did ask us to put together a report on social procurement with a specific focus on social enterprises. So we put together that report, which was essentially saying this is all the different ways you can do social procurement, or this is what our research has come across. And we made a couple of changes to our bylaw that allow some more flexibility with respect to social procurement and include sustainability in the definition of best value, which I think is a really foundational step. And now we are looking internally. So David mentioned the supply and demand side. There's a lot of work to be done on both sides to sort of create a really productive commercial relationship between the city and the city's social supply chain. But we're really focusing on what tools do our staff need to be able to integrate social considerations and community considerations more effectively into their procurements and their projects. So that's really where we're focused right now, while keeping up our relationships and continuing to build our partnerships outside of a policy. So we don't have an official policy in place. We're in what I would like to call the organizational readiness and piloting phase.
That's great. So we have Heather, who's provincial and in Newfoundland, Labrador, Jen, who's in an urban area in Ottawa, and then also joining us is Rachel from the rural municipality Wood Buffalo. Rachel, where is Wood Buffalo, and where are you in your on the journey?
Oh, thank you, David. We have a journey that's not linear, I think would be the best way to say it. We have been successful in implementing two tactics which fall under our program. And that's where we're looking first to prioritize whenever possible buying local. That would be for our below threshold purchases. And we were able to develop a local business directory to help support that. And we also have been able to implement a social procurement questionnaire, which looks at our social value objectives and incorporates it into each of our requests for proposals and requests for quotes. So whilst they're in place, we are committed to continuous improvement through them. And so we're kind of in that about to be, or we are starting to do the analytical work to see what, if any, tweaks we would have to make to those two aspects of the program. And then we are still on the journey of engagement and consultation, looking and exploring the options for community benefit agreements, which would be incorporated into our infrastructure procurement. So we've advanced further on some aspects of the program than others, but in all fairness, the municipalities started this journey in 2015 and a framework was established. So when we went to fully implement that aspect of the program, there was some great foundational work already done. So that allowed us to implement one part while we then continued to focus on another.
So part of this process is really, when we talk about it, social procurement is really leveraging existing purchasing to create that social value. So from each of you, can you talk a little bit about what's the why that's driving your decision? What are you trying to achieve through this policy in your community? Do you want to start, Jen?
Sure. So there's sort of two answers to this question. Council's perspective, it really came to the attention of council through the sort of economic impact of the pandemic. And that's the context in which our council has directed us to act. We were sort of before that and after that had been doing some of our own research into what opportunities there were under our current procurement program to expand our social impact and maximize it. So we had done a couple of projects. And really that comes from what I like to think of as the public servant's commitment to their role. Like we are all here to serve our communities. And when I brought some of these ideas forward to my management, they were so much more enthusiastic than I thought they would be, because there is a real desire, I think, in government to do what's best for community. We just have to create the rules and the frameworks that allow them and give them the space and the permission to do that.
That's really great phrase. Do what's best for the community. And Heather, your team's been spending time looking at this. What's driving the province to invest in this journey?
So I think a couple of things. Number one, we've been given a mandate to do this. So I can't speak to government's background, but I mean I think a few things. We launched a climate change action plan, and that directed, introduced a recommendation to do something around green procurement. That just seems to be a natural flow from that. And green procurement, of course, been around a little longer. And I think further to what Jen said, the pandemic really drove a lot of policy work around buying local. So I think that that drove that side of things. And then at the same time, our premier had established a task force to try to figure out ways to reduce expenditures, drive revenue where we can, do more with what we have. And I think one of the big recommendations that came out of that, from our perspective, was a recommendation to work on a policy around social procurement. So, that was really the base for that piece. So we're working on these pieces all together. But I mean, I think, we were finally given the mandate to really make a concerted effort to work towards this. And I think it's the idea of, as Jen alluded to, is just, you're buying stuff anyway. So rather than, just using your purchasing and treating it as an administrative function, there's so many strategic things that you can do with the purchasing function now, with procurement policy. And I think those ideas are just kind of coming to the forefront now through, work of folks like Buy Social Canada and, municipalities that are driving down this road. And I think the vocabulary is there where it wasn't there a few years ago. So I think that has certainly helped drive some of this as well.
So Rachel, Heather just said that you're driving the provincial, you're guiding the provincial, you're leading this because you're at the municipal level. So you're what, the largest geographic municipality in Canada, very diverse.
Second largest.
Second largest? Okay. What's driving this for you across your communities?
I wouldn't say it's much different than either Heather or Jen. There's commonality in what I'm hearing us say right now. And really, it's, as you mentioned, we know that we have the ability to create this benefit through our existing purchasing practices and spend. So it's tweaking the practices so that we can really generate the most community benefit. When we look at our council's strategic plan, we want to do everything within our ability to help support that. And so through looking at social procurement and in getting to the point that we could implement, we could really make sure that we were driving that community benefit with intention through our existing approved budgets. So that's really what drove it for us. How do we benefit our community?
So in order to get to that point, Rachel, what was the engagement with the community?
It was very significant. Um, we did engagement. When I think of community, we obviously have our internal stakeholders who are an important community. We commenced there with doing engagement. As I'd mentioned, we already had a framework, so it was really about, for some members, education or re-education, and what worked in that framework or didn't, and what were some ideas, and helping us to identify pilots at the onset. But that internal task force really became the champions across the organization and subject matter experts to help their specific departments. When we come to community engagement, it was amazing the interest and the desire for the community partners to be involved in this development and implementation of the program. Again, some of the members had been there when we did the original framework, so it was great with that foundational work that they had the knowledge. Heather, as you mentioned, the lingo, it was already there, so it was just a natural pickup to continue. But we engaged heavily with our business associations, as well as our social enterprise and our not-for-profit, and even opened the engagement up to any resident who wanted to come. And we had a series of different platforms so that they could give their input. And that's how collectively we've developed this program that's important then to the whole community, as opposed to just government.
Heather, you mentioned a number of different engagements. What was the purpose and how did you evaluate sort of that process of engagement? Because it sounds like it was pretty critical to your policy development.
It was, and it still is as we go down that road. I think, first it was looking at the other jurisdictions and, and speaking with, not just looking at their policies, but speaking with some of them and trying to figure out lessons learned and why did you go down this way and not this road. The other piece for us was online surveys, online consultations, trying to reach out to not only stakeholder groups and social enterprises, but to our supplier base as well to see if if there were any concerns there. The next phase we did, which we're just cluing up now, is speaking to our internal stakeholders. So that procurement group that will be doing the buying, just having that conversation of, are there concerns? Are there roadblocks? Are there questions? Are there any, myths that we needed to deal with? And then, and now we're going out to external stakeholders and having more of a sit down one-on-one on, what thoughts are, what the expectations are, how this may roll out, how this may affect stakeholders, how it may affect current suppliers. So I think that's the next phase of our consultation now, is just to sit down with various groups.
Jen, I know that the Ottawa community is pretty active in terms of community spokes. You have a very active United Way of Eastern Ontario in looking at this. How did that kind of environment support your engagement?
Well, it's vital to it. And I think the difference between a lot of traditional government consultations or community consultations and doing a consultation process to support social procurement is that you're not just getting feedback, you're building partnerships. And so when I have a department, our IT department came to me and said, what are we going to do with all these old laptops? Like, can we do something better with them? I knew immediately who to call, and they connected me with a nonprofit or with a collaboration that is now distributing all of the city's end of life, end of first life, I should say, technology. And so without those partnerships, had maybe 2 years ago, had IT sent us that email, we would have said, we don't know where you're supposed to go or who you're supposed to call. And now that we have that, it allows us to learn from each other. Like, social procurement is not about traditionally in government doing things for our community. It's about doing things with our community. And that's something that has really been like the spinal cord of our approach so far.
And that's a really, I think, the engagement process that we have found is part of the change management of adapting the culture to what you just referred to, Jen, was oftentimes procurement is seen as this economic transaction. and now we're changing it to actually a tool to build community. So it's really shifting that kind of, Heather, as you said, the mandate of what is the objective of procurement. But when we get into this journey, we often hear about different barriers and what you can't do and why you can't do it. And so, Heather, you mentioned that term. You had to look at what were some of the myths. And so, can you kind of like, what were some of those, what would you call them, myth busting process that you came across?
Uh, I think some of it was, the first thing we'll tend to hear, and I'm sure, you've heard this before. It's, well, we have this trade agreement, so we can't do anything over thresholds, because the trade agreements are in place. But that's just, you just have to look at the non-discrimination based on location. There's lots you can do outside of that, even over thresholds. I think the other side is it's funny because I think there were two sides of this, the bit of myth busting going on. I think it was, you had one side, people telling us, well, you can't do anything because of this. And, we kept hearing about trade agreements. But on the other side, we were also hearing, well, this stuff is just easy. Why didn't you implement it yesterday? You could just award points to all these people based on all this stuff that they do. So, there's a bit of that on the other side too, to say, hold on now, but how do you measure that? And how do you evaluate that? And how do you quantify that? And how's it relevant to this procurement? And it all needs to kind of fit together. So I think it was on both sides that we were getting, having to have conversations about, the reality of implementing this whenever this is done. So I think, but I think the consultations, it's been really funny because consultations have helped us learn a lot. And I fully agree with what Jen's saying with respect to a partnership, because the more I talk about this, the more I feel like that's the way this is going to roll out at the end of the day. It's going to be less about, big government direction, and more so us working with groups, working with suppliers, and working with our partners internally to implement this. But I think, the more that we talk about this, it's really helped inform both sides of that spectrum that I was hearing from on both sides. So it's been really helpful that way for everybody, I think.
So, Jen, were there some myths that you guys came up against, like from council or for others who just were saying, well, we'd like to do this, but I heard, or
There's always that, and that's part of the reason I think they you need someone who understands the nuances of the trade agreements on your team to be able to help navigate some of those things. But the truth is, anywhere in government and in any decision we make or process we have in relation to the trade agreements, there is space between what the rules say and what we are used to doing. So much of the pushback that we get is, oh, well, we've never done it this way before. And it sort of gets assumed that there's a reason for that. And inertia just kind of takes over, and everyone all of a sudden thinks it's a rule. So you need someone with some credibility to come in and be able to say, well, actually, this doesn't mean what you think it means. And maybe if we changed our practices, we would be able to see some of these benefits. But truthfully, when David, one of my favorite expressions of yours is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And procurement culture and procurement frameworks that have been developed since, governments were in existence, were all started with anti-corruption. And so they were not originated to facilitate the achievement or the contributions towards the government's strategic priorities. It was a compliance function. And that takes time to work our way out of. It takes time, it takes tools and a good communication strategy to work your way out of that mindset. Or at least, to expand that mindset.
so I'm not gonna, someone much smarter than me came up, that was Peter Drucker, who's one of my heroes. So I always use that. So it is that cultural resistance, and sometimes we create barriers. So Rachel, when you started to go into this, um, one of the things we often hear is that, this is just more government red tape. This is another step in government pushing against this opportunities. Did you find that when you started to move toward implementation?
We definitely heard concerns about red tape. And from the supplier's perspective, sometimes they don't feel there's enough time already to respond to a procurement, and this is just another added layer. Um, and we took that feedback sincerely and thought, then how can we make the program work to alleviate those concerns? So when I referenced that we had the questionnaire, we actually standardized that questionnaire and we have it publicly posted on a website that we've dedicated just for social procurement, so that any potential bidder knows that it's there and they can always go and look at it to see what we're expecting, and that also helps them prepare it. So they could have they have advanced knowledge of what we would ask. They can collect the information that we would ask to substantiate their responses. So it helps to alleviate that look of red tape because it's there and we don't plan on changing it for every procurement, recognizing that time is valuable, especially when you're under a deadline to meet a particular bid. So that's what we did to help alleviate that.
So it's interesting that all of you talked about the mitigation of the myths, like information engagement. Um, how would you measure that kind of need for creating collaborative efforts to move that culture and behavior? Jen, do you want to? You kind of referred to that culture issue.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't know that we figured that out yet. I think initially there have to be tools in place like the questionnaire, like template evaluation criteria, in order to support. And there also has to be expertise. If you're going to ask a bunch of engineers to evaluate social value criteria, like they're going to freak out. And so you have to be able to say, we have resources for you that will help you learn how to do this. That's part of it. And then once we have kind of done that and everybody has the skills and everybody has the tools, then you can use all the data you've collected from those questionnaires that maybe I don't know if yours are evaluated. Some of them are, some of them aren't. You can use all that data you've collected to be able to create a policy that has some teeth, that sets real standards, and that's enforceable and achievable based on the data you've collected. So I hope that that's the process you would need to follow, because that's what we're trying to do.
So Heather, you mentioned the internal, and in a province as geographically large and diverse, and you have a staff of, the social development side and you have a staff of the procurement side. How is that collaboration helping to move the dialogue forward?
I think it's been really helpful. I think, like I said, the consultations have turned into more conversations on a lot of fronts too. And just, a lot of, what Rachel was saying just sounds really familiar here as well, of trying to, mitigate any potential red tape and trying to just temper any large expectations on the other side. But I mean, I think, culturally for us, I think the big shift. And one of the other drivers for allowing this to happen was, we had a major change in our legislation a few years ago. So we had moved from a lowest price only, tender only approach to procurement to one that mandates the achievement of best value in procurement. And I think that was another big shift for us, and also helped move the culture along, because we just see this as an extension of best value, really. So, I think that really helped move that piece along. And it's legislation that, is a diverse province and a scattered population across the province. But it's that one piece of legislation too that is out there now that we operate under, that has really helped move this along substantially, where we never really had the room to move before.
Rachel, you mentioned at the beginning the emphasis on local, and so much of the work in your municipality is done by global partners in coming in, like the big oil companies, and because it's a small rural indigenous community, oftentimes big projects mean outside contractors. How did this collaboration help build some of those understanding of the opportunity for the local and indigenous businesses?
That's a great question, David. And if I don't get to all of it, let me know because I'll go off on different tangents, I'm sure. Through the consultation or engagement, um, we knew that from looking at our strategic priority, local is a priority. However, we also know that we are within the parameters of the trade agreements where you can't give preference to local. So as it came to the first tactic where we looked at our low value and below value thresholds, we really worked with our business associations and ran generic social media and whatnot communications to let our vendors know that we want to prioritize doing work with you when we can. And so therefore, the creation of that local business directory was critical because it allowed us to identify who all was out there and what services or categories they were able to contract with us for. And then through the development of this, we're able to, when we're looking at those low value or below value, able to send out the opportunity to anybody who's in that database registered with that category. So the knowledge you don't have really can hinder you because we found of vendors that we didn't really necessarily know about or our business partners didn't know about. But we were able to build this really large database so that they knew of all the people. So we didn't have to necessarily leave the region. But I have to caution that that's only for our below threshold. So it doesn't always necessarily help with our big jobs at all.
So that's one piece of your strategy you found. Are there other pieces that were critical in the process that you can reflect on that helped move it forward?
Oh, 100%. I would say the most important part of our strategy was engagement. And when I refer to engagement, I just don't mean at the onset when you're doing development. Once we went to council and had approval to move forward with policy, which we supported with a procedure, um, we developed training materials, but that training material just wasn't for internal. It was with our external stakeholders as well, so that they would be aware of this change. Um, we developed, as I had mentioned, a social procurement landing page that was available to anybody at any time to look at. Through our ongoing engagement, we heard questions that were really great questions, but we didn't want it just to be limited to one engagement. So we developed a frequently asked question document that anybody would then know what was said in one engagement in going to this particular website that I had referenced. I can't underestimate or can't, I don't think anybody should underestimate the importance of engagement through it, but it's not just until you get to a certain point in time in your journey or along your journey. For us, it was very important, and we said to our council, this is going to be a journey that doesn't end. It's going to be continuous improvement. And actually, to help support that, we also developed a social procurement working group, which is comprised of community partners as well as internal stakeholders so that we can work collaboratively now, as Jen had mentioned, the importance of that analytics from looking at the questionnaire and seeing what those responses are to really then help enhance and further develop the program. So that's the stage we're at with that particular aspect of the tactic under our program, is working with the working group to see how can we further enhance this program. So it's never a stop point, but the engagement's so critical, and it's not just the onset engagement, it's that continuous engagement and outreach.
Jen, you mentioned that council sort of gave you some directive, uh, kind of indicating that was a critical push to get this moving. Were there other pieces in your journey that you would say were kind of important steps or important pieces that helped with the development of where you are today?
Yes. Um, similarly to what Rachel mentioned, building the internal networks, the external networks, and then bringing those networks together was really important. I think it's really vital to have someone from your procurement with some procurement expertise involved, because they really have a good understanding of how decisions are made in your organization. How are purchasing decisions made? At what point along the project spectrum should we be looking at environmental considerations, at social considerations? Because there are things you need to look at the beginning of a project. And then there are things you need to be looking at the procurement phase, which is usually towards the end um, of the contracting process. And so understanding that timeline of how projects get developed, how projects get approved, and then how the procurement process works allows you to get the right people in the room to get their buy-in. And also, so knowing your organization and how decisions are made in your organization, people think it's the same everywhere. It's not. There are differences. And so, having that internal knowledge and then going out and figuring out the sort of social economic landscape in your community is sort of your external version of that. Who is the best partner for this type of thing? You need to know those things and be really engaged, and frankly, be willing to not be successful in order to try things, and to not be successful in order to figure out who your really essential partners are. Because at the beginning, you got to work with the willing and able, and not everybody is both of those things. Once you get into policy implementation, then you can start tackling the people who are less willing and less able. But certainly for us, identifying who was willing and able at the outset was really important. And that took a really long time.
So Heather, the willing and the able in the province sounds like there were some policy shifts, but in my experience, those don't happen in a void. So what were some of the pieces that led up to that mandate?
I think, like I said, I think it's just a shift across the country and a shift globally that this language is now kicking around out there. I think it's just the conversation of, again, I think the pandemic drove some of this. The change in our legislation, I think, certainly envisioned using procurement more as a tool, not just a purchasing function. So I think that really made, hold some of the shift as well. But I think too, just the willingness to look at some of this stuff and the understanding of, you're spending money anyway, so why shouldn't it achieve more than just getting the thing? I think that understanding, and it's funny, you talk about the myth busting and everything else. And, I think when I started out, I had all these things in my head. Okay, if they say this, my response will be this. And if they say this, but the one big thing that I was expecting to hear from everybody was like, oh, this is going to cost us more. And we're not getting that at all, which I think, I can't really speak to what's causing this shift, but it seems to have happened because, I think, again, with our legislation changing from price only to best value, that was a shift in and of itself. And I don't know if that was just, the start of a shift, or if that was the result of things that had already started moving along that we got caught up in. But I mean, I think that understanding and that accepting of doing more with what we have, I think is certainly it's out there now. And I think it's just, again, it's one of the big pushbacks that I expected to hear that I haven't heard in this whole process.
And I think what we've experienced is a shift in that language around that when you look at budgets, it's not just how we save, it's how do we spend wealth.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a real shift from everybody, from saying, oh, taxes are about collecting it. And people starting to say, no, we're all going to contribute, but what's the best value that we're going to create for communities. So it's a great way to phrase it. If you were going to start this, Jen, and someone calls you up tomorrow and says, "Hey, we're going to go on this social procurement journey," what would your recommendations be?
I think my biggest thing would be you have to invest in it, not from a perspective of you're going to spend more if you do social procurement, but from the perspective of there's no one in your organization that knows how to do this. And I think there's pieces of it, there's pieces of the puzzle that are levels of expertise from all sorts of operational groups, as well as your community and social services experts. But there needs to be a centralized function that's continuing in order to put all those pieces together. And we don't have that yet. We're designing it. Like when I first started all of this, I thought it was going to be a project where I create a database and create an internal website, create some procurement tools, and then departments would kind of go on their way. And looking back, that was so naive because the operational technical folks and the community benefit folks, like those different areas of expertise, they don't even know how to talk to each other. And so they needed a little bit of facilitation, and we're seeing that in every project. So I think that would be my first is if you start this, understand that it's not going to end.
We refer to it as a journey. Rachel, you've been on that journey for a while. And always when we do a journey, we get to like places where there might be a challenge in the road or something. Have there been any particular challenges or opportunities that you would kind of advise others to watch for or be aware of? Or, you know, journey is not a very linear thing in social procurement. It's
No, it's certainly not linear. And as I think to challenges or opportunities, it really depends how you look at it. I think my greatest advice would be a few parts, actually. I never only have 1 or 2 cents. My first one would be that opportunity is really to remember and keep true why you're on this journey, because that will steer you back to it. Um, and what I've learned the most is I'd mentioned there was a significant amount of foundational work done before I had joined the organization. I almost felt like I came into it and had the most to learn from our existing, like our employees as well as our community. And so for me, it was just being open minded because I was probably that trade agreement guru who was trying to figure out how to fit all this together. But it was just really being open minded and listening and active listening, and then really figuring out how we could do a program that would satisfy so many people or so many different interests and hold true to our strategic plan. And so that's where I think the greatest opportunity was through that active listening. If I think of the challenges, probably our greatest challenge has been getting to the point where we could implement. It wasn't a journey that happened overnight by any means. And unfortunately, the initiative, the focus on the initiative was put on hold for us a few times because of natural disasters and pandemics, which nobody ever thought would come about when we were starting this and moving along on it. So that's where I mentioned that first part about holding true to why you're doing this. And that truth will always take you back to that journey to progress it once you get over one thing that there's a challenge in there that might have been unexpected.
Heather, when as you kind of engaged in this across the province, what were some of the challenges that you found, and what would be some recommendations to those who are thinking about this journey or entering into it?
I think the conversations have been important. So, like I said, they're turning into less consultations and more conversations, and I think that's really been helpful. So it's been a bit of a two-way street of, you know, us learning from experiences that other people have had, as well as us communicating where we think we need to go and where we can go with this. I think, I think the communication, and I think Rachel really spoke to this, which is really striking me the more we work on towards this, is that it's going to be baby steps. I think when I started this, again, Jen said very, very naively thought that, yeah, we're going to launch this great policy and it's going to be out there and it's going to be fantastic and it's going to change the world. And it's so silly when I look back now, because the more, we have conversations and speak to other people who've gone down this road. I think it's going to be baby steps starting off. And I think that's, part of our communication too, is just to say, bear with us. And I think another thing, and that we're realizing too, so, while we're still working on the policy, we've internally, my group, I've said, policy is not in place, but, there's stuff we can do here. Why don't we start looking at things? And if we fail, it's okay, but at least we'll take something from that. I think, what Jen said is really striking to me when we started looking at this, is that it's okay not to be successful at the start. And we've already had some of those where we've tried to put something in place and realized very quickly, okay, that's not going to work. So we backtrack and try to find something else that we can actually measure to see, and put that in place. So, somebody said before, you don't really learn much from your successes. You learn a lot from your failures. So we're just starting to poke some holes into it internally ourselves, and are really learning a lot from that already.
So Rachel, Heather says her program's going to change the world. What are your objectives with the Wood Buffalo policy? What would you, if if you could jump ahead 5 years, what would be some of the things you'd say this was successful?
Yeah, I think, I've said this before, and maybe well, it would be a wonderful opportunity. I don't want to say jinx myself, but I would love in 5 years to be sitting back with our community partners saying, we've maxed all this. We're hitting high percentages on what we set out to do, being our social value objectives and obtaining them. Let's rewrite this whole program. Where do we want to strive to go to next? I say that, but it would still be a lot of work, but it's that commitment to that journey where you never stop. For us, our social objectives, our social value objectives are really tied back to business diversity and supportive employment. So I would love to, it would be a little premature right now because we're still doing the analytics on that first 6 months of full implementation. But I'd like to take that as base points and say in 5 years, I guess, I'd like to look to see how we could actually rewrite the program, because I'd like to see us so high there. So looking to see where we want to go to next and how we want to grow, because I think that when you have your targets in place, once you hit 75, 80% of your value, I don't think you're going to lose that value. So then you just say, what's next that we want to put into that program?
Jen, where do you see your success in the future? So you could look back and say, time to pop the champagne.
I think that if we had, see, the idea of writing a policy and then rewriting it in 5 years is like heartbreaking to me. So I won't aim quite as lofty as Rachel did. And I've always been really hesitant to put in a policy that doesn't have some real teeth to it. And so I think if we, had a policy with real standards, and we had, staff executing and being able to comply with that policy, and having everything they needed to comply with that policy successfully, it wouldn't shock me if that took 5 years. That might just be because people in Ottawa don't move that fast, but I think it's going to take that time to develop that data. And I would really like a staffed program in place as a centralized hub for staff and for community partners to manage that relationship and to manage that network. I think, and that's something that we're working towards. But if we could have those two things, I would be thrilled.
Heather, what would be your thrilling 5-year outcomes?
Um, and I think for me, having the policy in place and having procurement folks just proactively implementing it. I think, there's going to be a lot of, develop the policy, a lot of capacity building, followed by some, teeth pulling, and I think too the understanding of, and Rachel mentioned too, like, some red tape, but I think it's not for red tape, but I think just the understanding that there's going to be, a little extra lead in required to think about how this policy and how implementing this policy works with your procurement. And I think having some lead in time to think about that. And I think if that's in place and people are doing it proactively and coming to us saying, here's how I think this will work, I think I would be very happy with that.
Great. I'm going to just quickly thank each of you and then also just ask the audience or the participants, however we refer to them today, if there's any questions, you put them in the chat. Doug, I don't know if you want to come back and help facilitate the discussion. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David.
And I don't know if you had any questions come up during the conversation that you wanted to ask to the panelists, but I think we got a really good kind of concept of the journey, right? It's like it's iterative, but it's also many different parts. So there's the engagement, there's the policy design, there's the tool design, the resources. Like Rachel referred to their landing page, which is really a great resource. Heather talked about the internal and external kind of engagement, and Jen talking about what it takes in a community. So it really was a good description, I think, of the social procurement journey. Any questions from our chat room?
So I just got a message here that the triple dot menu that is next to the chat function will open the Q&A function for folks who do have questions. They can either ask them in there or put some
There it is.
comments into the chat. Yeah, and I just wanted to say thank you again as well to the panelists. This was a really great discussion. It was, when you're talking about government frameworks and policies and procedures, it's for some of us, it kind of just, doesn't sound the most interesting. But really what I took from it is systems change. This is change management at the systems level. And, I think, Jen, you mentioned earlier that, the function of what procurement was originally designed to do was to serve and, as a compliance measure, often doesn't have a strategy around it. So we're thinking about how do you build internal strategies around frameworks that typically have never been thought of in that context. So it was really really great to hear the conversations and recognizing, like you said, David, that the journey isn't linear and it's always iterative. And I think that's important because when we think of policy, we tend to want to get it right the first time, and that's usually not possible in this context. So it's great to see your leadership across the country on this and your work to make this happen. Just a couple of quick comments around that change management component, because I don't think it's really difficult when you're talking about change management within government, because you're dealing with not just one form of government. You're dealing with multiple departments, ministries at different levels, and so that change management is really important. But I really took a couple of things to heart there. One was that the sort of consultations, conversations that Heather you mentioned. That phrase was really great because yeah, you can consult, but meaningful consultation is leading to those partnerships, and that's great. And then that compliance function to culture that Jen you referenced, that sort of cultural component. How do you build a culture around procurement? It's not easy, but again, those are really great lessons to share with folks. And maybe just I might add too that it's not limited to just governments. Procurement can be done in any setting. social procurement. It doesn't have to be limited to governments. Large corporations, even small businesses can adopt that sort of approach to the work. So yes, wanted to say thank you. And then I don't see any questions coming in at the moment, but I do have a couple of comments or comments from Mel. Just saying that you know, as a business manufacturer here in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, they're looking to incorporate these principles essentially into their activities, and was able to get a lot from this meeting. And that's the three of you, and David, I guess you too, as moderator, are all on the same page. So that's great to see folks around here. Oh, I got a comment here in the chat from Tom Cooper. From a change management standpoint, are there any major risks to avoid in developing appropriate strategies around social procurement, especially for SMEs? So we can throw that to our moderator and to our panelists. Thank you, Tom, for kicking us off.
I think Rachel mentioned some of them, and I think we've, even in our By Social Canada team meeting this morning, we're talking about some of the risks of how you post and how you engage and make the opportunities accessible to small and medium-sized businesses. So there's below threshold opportunities, but when you get to the bidding process, that we're not building up and putting in red tape or barriers, because I think in the procurement process, I think we're all learning you can make it more accessible. And I think, Rachel, maybe some of the tools that you've developed would be a good example for inclusion of SMEs.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, David, and I referenced a bit, the internet page that we developed has all the tools internally or externally that can be accessed. So it really tells that journey, but it also shows what we're going to be looking for, and that to me helps reduce the barriers that there could be, particularly when there's on tight timelines. I think when it comes to change management as well, we worked really hard with BiSocial to make sure that we had all the templates and the foundational pieces in place before we went back to our SMEs, and really spent the time working and training and ongoing to make sure that the confidence is there to have champions within the business, recognizing one department can't lead this on their own. And then within my team, we also then took somebody from our leadership team who kind of acted as but is our procurement SME. I mean, I always try to make myself available as well, but if there's anybody that ever has queries, having that dedicated resource that they can go to funnel queries to, I think that really helped with the change management avenue as well, because nobody was left to feel like they were on their own.
Yes.
Sorry, is SMEs in this context small, medium-sized enterprises or subject matter experts? Because I can read the question in both ways. And that's why I was looking blankly at the screen.
I will let Tom clarify in the chat. And while he does, I don't know if Heather, you wanted to tackle that that question.
Yeah, I think the SME piece, you know, I think we do a lot under thresholds, and we actually introduced a couple of measures at the start of the pandemic to help support local suppliers. So we increased our thresholds for an open call, so that gave us more opportunity to do limited calls and direct our quotes to local suppliers. We also introduced a 10% discount, for lack of a better word, for local suppliers whenever the value of the procurements were under trade agreement threshold. So we introduced that as well for local suppliers, and most of our local suppliers are SMEs. So, I mean, I think the other side is too, when I talked about, you know, us starting off with baby steps, it's not just for us because we're learning. It's not just for our clients, the other public bodies, because they're just learning. For me too, it's making sure that we right size this for our supplier community. So, relatively speaking, and relative to other provinces, we have a fairly, smaller supplier community. I mentioned they are largely SMEs. So, I'm really conscious of not implementing these requirements under some policy that they can't meet because they're SMEs. So, requiring that they meet apprenticeship targets and all this sort of thing when you're a little contracting company of, 5 people. So that's not reasonable. And it's something that we can't expect our little, small suppliers to meet. So we have to sort of right size it and figure out what social procurement looks like in that context. So, I think it is a piece that we're constantly thinking about as we think about what this policy needs to look like.
Yeah, and I think we got clarification. It's a question of the SME doing a social procurement policy. And I think what Doug mentioned is it's very similar. It's like you're looking at what's the best value you want to create in your supply chain. So you're looking at, whether it's IT or whether it's catering or whatever, creating a social procurement policy as a small business is a really effective way of enhancing your contribution to community because you're already hiring people, you're investing, you're probably local, so you're using, how are you using local suppliers? Are you prioritizing a social value? So I don't think it's any, as Doug said, this is not just government, this is private sector, this is nonprofits. We all buy stuff. And if we can think about that collective purchasing power, whether we're a business or a nonprofit or a government, it's huge. And that's what we're trying to do. So I don't know that it's any different than looking at what are you trying to achieve and how can you build those values into your supply chain.
So, Jen, I don't know if you wanted to tackle that question now.
I think we can go to another question if we're tight for time.
Okay, perfect.
Doug, do
Okay.
you have an example of a local purchase from a social enterprise? That was one of the questions.
Yep, that's one of the questions. Yeah.
I have an answer for that if you
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, we had a really hard time, as you can imagine, in Ottawa. It's hard to find people who want to do waste collection from the back of our garbage trucks. This has always been a struggle to find enough labor to meet that need. And so they got connected through procurement to a social enterprise called the Somali Center for Family Services that supports a lot of new Canadians, specifically refugees, as they're getting started in Canada. One really nice thing about a job like that is you don't need to have great English skills. You don't need to have great, you don't need to have your education equivalencies addressed yet. So for that first, we have people working for us that have been in Canada for a month. And it's not like a forever solution. There's a lot of other, supports that need to be in place. But it keeps it keeps some of that population off social assistance and able to afford housing and all of that kind of stuff. And in addition, it meets a need for labor that the city has. So that's one example that I think was really effective. And the thing I want to point out about that is that they were actually they started this business for the city. And since we changed our bylaw and we can now sole source up to thresholds to social enterprises that are owned by nonprofits and charities, there's so much more potential to work with community partners to build social enterprises that meet the city's needs. One example that we are really hoping works is food services provisions for our new main library. So, with luck and we've been negotiating with them for months now, and we're able to have those conversations with them because of our ability to sole source to a social enterprise. So those are a couple of examples that I hope are illustrative.
Great example. Thanks, Jen. Sorry, Matthew, your question snuck in before Tom's and I didn't see it, but the question is, how do we nudge community to participate and support social procurement / investment in social enterprises, especially for folks that don't have an invested interest in this work?
So I think part of that is what we're doing today, Doug.
I was just thinking, turning it into conversations, eh?
I think once we have some success stories, I think that will certainly help.
Success stories helps.
Yeah.
Community partners can help a lot too, and this sort of leads into another question about how community partners can participate. But Ottawa Community Foundation has an ability where when you donate, you can choose which of their initiatives your donation goes to, or you can just put it in the pot. And one thing that they're doing is developing a social enterprise platform, which is intended to provide centralized business resources for all local social enterprises. And so if you want to start a social enterprise, you don't necessarily have to worry about marketing or worry about accounting and someone to keep your books, because they've created this resource that can support you and can centralize that expertise, so that as a social enterprise, which is usually a small business owner, you don't have to invest as much of your capital in that as a for-profit small business who's starting out has to.
And I would add that in the city of Calgary, it was really the community economic development and the small business community that pushed council to do their project. I mean, they were the ones who went to a counselor and said, you should be doing this. In Peterborough, it came from an employee at a immigrant service who went to a counselor and said, we should be doing this. In Winnipeg, it came from the community economic development and the small. So I think community actually becomes the advocate for government policy to be created to create the opportunities. So I think the community role is so vital to the engagement, because it has to come with, and I think we're back to what Jen mentioned at the beginning, is we're trying to create the best value for community, and community often is best at saying, here's another tool we could use. So I think the role of community is often an advocate and a supporter and a collaborator to make it work.
Yeah, and related to that too, I mean, in my experience prior to moving to St. John's, we worked really closely with Ottawa Community Housing to develop a procurement policy around that. And what made it really interesting was that it was aligned with their strategy, right? So that connection from a values perspective and strategy perspective to a procurement perspective was a little bit easier to transition in a way that, as I think it was Jen, you mentioned before, like it's hard to connect those values to a procurement framework that doesn't have its own strategy and culture built around it. So but it does take the role of community to really highlight, I think, what opportunities can exist.
Well, I mentioned, just to jump in, I mentioned before too that the lingo's out there now, and people are talking about this, and the phrase social procurement is kicking around internally. But I mean, I think that's how it got in here. I think there are community groups advocating for what they're doing, and what as a social enterprise what they're doing, or small businesses what they're doing, or what we can achieve by supporting local, and what we can achieve by supporting environmental objectives. And I think that's how a lot of that language got in here to us. I think is those community groups engagement with government. And I mentioned that lingo's kicking around, but I mean, I think that's how it got in here in the first place. So I think it is an important connection.
Just going through the comments here, the chat here. So Mandy was excited to hear that the government of Newfoundland Labrador is allowing for social procurement, because she works at a nonprofit that relies heavily on government funding, and they try to practice social procurement as much as possible. I know Mandy and I would have no question about that. There's another question that just popped in here. What are some of the barriers that social enterprises face when trying to overcome some procurement benchmarks? Specifically, how are municipalities and governments providing a level playing field through policies and procedures? That question.
Insurance is a big one. When you have a standard across the board $5 million CGL requirement, it's really hard for a lot of small businesses and social enterprises to get that, especially if they're not guaranteed a contract. So that's one really concrete example. And how we're dealing with that is, or trying to deal with that is, our procurement staff are trained to sort of identify what does a low risk contract look like. Because we do have the discretion to deviate from that standard, but it has to be requested. So we can do that insurance review. So procurement officers are trained to do that. Also, whenever I do these things for social enterprises in Ottawa, I always say use your inquiry process in the procurement section. There are so many small businesses and social enterprises who will look at a procurement and say, well, I can't do that thing, so I might as well not put in the effort. It's not worth my time to figure out how to make this submission. But if you make use of the inquiries, procurement will become really, they can amend it. And so if it's not really necessary and you don't think it's really necessary and it's a barrier, ask about it. How necessary is it? And see, we've had a lot of good movement that way, but it requires training on the internal and the external.
It's funny, actually, we've just started doing and putting emphasis on some supplier development, and that is one of the things that we emphasize so much. We have so many stories of people coming to us after and said, well, if it wasn't for X, we could have bid. And there's opportunity, to amend things, like you said, if it's unnecessary, and and we've done some of that. So we procure here goods and services. So similarly, you talk about insurance. I mean, we've removed the requirement for bid bonds for most of our procurements because it was just seen as a barrier to any small business. So there are some changes that we've made, but I mean I can't emphasize that enough. Just using that QA feature, and some things can be adjusted, and it sometimes could be an oversight on our part.
The other thing we've seen is some municipalities have actually unbundled some larger contracts. Like on Vancouver Island, one of the municipalities has a large maintenance program for parks. And so they took 10% of it and directly awarded it to a social enterprise that employs people facing barriers. Because they can do that, but they can't do all the park services. So it's really looking and being creative, and that's what we're seeing. I think what you're talking about, Heather, and Jen, and that willingness on the part of the purchaser to listen to, like, what are the opportunities that could be created, which I think is really one of the biggest shifts in social procurement from traditional procurement, is this collaborative to create the community value. It's not like we're locked into this. I think we're seeing, and Rachel, I think from our work in Wood Buffalo, we've seen that collaborative discussion, like with the Indigenous communities. It's like, here's what we need in order to be successful. And it might just be, give us 3 months to look at an RFP, not 3 weeks, because we're small businesses. So I'm finding that it is that two-way street that I think the purchasers are becoming much, much more open to how do we create that value.
Yeah, I'd love to go back to the question posed by Heather about some examples, because I know, Jen, you gave the example from Ottawa, but are there other examples that Heather or Rachel that you'd add to that? So I think the more examples we can show, the stronger the conversations get.
How we've used social enterprises?
Yeah.
So I know we don't do construction on our side, but as I mentioned, we're in the middle of conversations and consultations, and one of the conversations we had today was with our housing corporation, who does renovations on houses, and they occasionally some of those renovations are done by a construction company here, Impact Construction. And I can't, I don't want to speak to everything they do and mess it up, but I mean, I know that they're a social enterprise, and they develop skills and youth and give them jobs, and those people move on, they bring in new people and they give them skills and develop jobs, and it's just so it's a social enterprise that actually does work with our housing corporation and renovations and some building and that sort of thing. We hear, when you're under threshold and you can get quotes or direct your business to certain businesses. We tend to, if we have a function here or a coffee break or anything like that, we have social enterprises that makes these really great baked goods that we tend to use here. And there's a new one that opened recently that makes pizza that I had yesterday that is really great. So they're popping up all over the place, and that's one thing that we emphasize too, is that that ability under threshold to direct some of your business, and and we do things like that, right? We have meetings and we keep things catered and that sort of thing too. So there's social enterprises around here to do that. So that's how we use some of them.
Great, thanks for that. David, David shared also in the chat for folks. Lots of stories on the Buy Social Canada website.
Lots of stories, YouTube stories. Embers has a great video from winning the, Governor General's Award, and we're just seeing it all across the country. We're seeing small stories and big stories of real success. It was real interesting. We met with the minister of ESDC about a month ago, and with social enterprises from the community, and she started to talk. They said, no, we don't want more grants, or we want your contracts. Give us a contract, we'll do more good. And I think that's a real shift of the relationship as well. Those stories are coming from community of really, like you said, Heather, hiring, people, or hiring youth, like, impact construction, more and more. So thanks again, Doug, Mariana, for this chance for the chat. This has been great.
Yeah. So I'm gonna just clue us up here. I'm gonna share some information. Bear with me here now. So thanks again. I just want to say thanks to David and our panelists, Heather, Jennifer, and Rachel. It's great to get all of your experience and knowledge and how you're implementing this in your work. Thanks again to Darcy for hosting with the technical components, and to Mariana with the Center for Social Enterprise, who's had a bit of a busy afternoon because she's convocating from her MBA program this afternoon. So congrats on that, Mariana. And on behalf of all of the members of the Social Innovation NL Coalition, thank you for your time, and appreciate all of your participation and all of the attendees making time in the day. And this is just one of the events that are planned around the social procurement conversations and initiatives. So this was the opening panel, and in 2 weeks, about 2 weeks now, there will be a summit on sort of starting Wednesday afternoon, and then into Thursday and Friday. You can find out more information on the website below, but would definitely encourage folks who are especially local here in St. John's and across the province, if they're able to make it in person, that would be great. And thanks again to our panelists. Thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate your time today. And I'm going to stop sharing and say goodbye for everybody. And thanks again. We'll be in touch to share more information on the summit in the coming days. So thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.